Patterns. Almost everywhere you look, you can see them. In nature, in technology, in the very fabric of our universe. So intertwined they are within and around us that we are often oblivious to their existence, which can be problematic because certain patterns have been playing out over and over and over and over again, almost like a mathematical formula, one that almost always adds up to the same result: disaster. In this case, the pattern I'm talking about is human nature. How many of us seem to experience a cerebral shutdown when the promise of the things that we covet most are dangled before our eyes. Beauty, sex, money, status. And time after time, like a moth drawn to the flame, humans, no matter how rich and powerful and sophisticated, just can't help but keep on getting themselves burned. And that's what we'll be looking at today. A few examples, some familiar and some new, of people who have decided to exploit this pattern to get to what they want. It's a tale as old as time. A young and beautiful individual approaches someone or a group of people, usually men in positions of authority and power, and often with the promise of something more. They manage to get these people to do their every bidding. I've covered a few anti-feminists that exemplify this tactic, but some of these operators don't even have to so much as touch these individuals in power to get them eating right out of their hands. In many instances, and this is part of the pattern of human nature, the mere fact of being beautiful with this overhanging promise of a sexual encounter that will probably never happen is oftentimes more than enough to get the job done. Take Elizabeth Holmes, for instance, someone we have covered on this channel before, who charmed the most powerful men in America to work for her without, as far as we know, so much as touching them, apart from a handshake or a pat on the back. But since then, and I've alluded to this at the end of my Elizabeth Holmes video, despite the lessons that should have been learned from her case, another young and conventionally attractive woman managed to come out of the ether and con one of the world's biggest and most sophisticated financial institutions at the drop of a hat. Meet Charlie Javice or Javice. I've heard her name being pronounced in both ways. A woman now in her early 30s who allegedly defrauded $175 million from JP Morgan Chase. And I say allegedly because she hasn't been found guilty yet. And while I can't conclusively pin down the brief success of her con to her beauty, she seems to have followed a very similar path to Elizabeth, who I see as her predecessor. Now, given the magnitude and the sophistication of Charlie's target, to me, this story in particular exemplifies how persistent these patterns of human behavior or human nature are, and how difficult it is to break them despite the lessons, despite the number of times that they've led to disaster in the past. Much like Meghan Markle and Amber Heard and Elizabeth Holmes, as dictated by step 1 of the Anti-Feminist Handbook, Charlie did her research and invented a persona along with an appropriate backstory that she knew would push just the right buttons to put her on the map and propel her straight into the offices of money-hungry, gargantuan entities like JP Morgan. Long story short, she founded a company called Frank in 2016, which created a software that aimed to make the application process for student loans faster and easier in the United States. As with Elizabeth, Her business model had this halo of benevolence to it. And like Elizabeth, her good looks and her youth quickly turned her into a media darling. And again, we see a pattern forming. Like I said, they're everywhere. All you have to do is pay attention enough to notice them. Charlie engages in the typical pattern, which I have dubbed as step 2 of the anti-feminist handbook, of portraying herself as the feminist girl boss, complete with a sob story of how her own impoverished beginnings and struggles with student debt drove her to create Frank. In yet another familiar pattern, remember how Elizabeth Holmes was featured on the cover of Forbes magazine 30 Under 30 as an impressive self-made billionaire? Well, not that Charlie attained billionaire status, but she too, 4 years later, or is it 5 years later, was slapped onto the Forbes magazine list of 30 Under 30, which is hilarious, considering the humiliation they must have felt after not only the Elizabeth Holmes debacle, but Forbes has this curse or this problem with putting on con artists in their lists and the covers of their magazines. Charlie's story eventually caught the eyes of JP Morgan Chase, as I said, eager to get their greedy little hands on a database of supposedly 5 million students, college-age students, that Charlie claimed were signed up to Frank's services. They offered her a cool $175 million for the software, which saw Charlie personally pocketing somewhere between $26 and $45 million. The numbers vary depending on the news source. But I find it so funny and ironic how when you have regular folks like us applying to work for JP Morgan, let's say, not that I've ever applied to work for them in particular, but anyone who's applied to work for a big established company would know all the hoops that you have to jump through. The job interviews, the personality tests, the aptitude tests, the background checks, just to get an entry-level job with them. But when it comes to the allure of beauty and the promise of millions, all of that gets thrown right out the window, which is unfortunate because remember how the formula always ends in disaster? Yeah. That's pretty much what ended up happening in this case. Turns out, like her predecessors before her, there was no rags to riches story. Charlie actually hails from a very wealthy family with 2 highly educated parents with master's degrees and her father working on Wall Street. And much like Elizabeth, there was no hugely successful innovation to help the vulnerable in society. There were no 5 million students in Frank's database because Charlie had invented almost every single one of them. So much like Spotify did with the Sussexes and the various multi-billion-dollar conglomerates and families did with Elizabeth Holmes, it appears that JP Morgan, with all its might and sophistication, made the enormous mistake of buying Charlie's software and paying her millions before doing any due diligence. And when they did, well, it was a little late in the game at that point. Patterns. Patterns as far as the eye can see. Now, if only those pesky little greedy elites would pay attention to them. JP Morgan has since shut down Frank after acquiring it, and they are suing Charlie for fraud. And the disaster ensues because, in addition to a lawsuit, Charlie is also facing criminal charges, much like her predecessor, Elizabeth Holmes. She, of course, is denying the allegations, which is really crazy if you actually look into this case in detail, because I'm just giving you a summary. There is a significant amount of solid evidence of her con. You know, as far as planning and plotting the invention of these 5 million or so student accounts. Her defense so far is, oh, I only invented these fake accounts to abide by student privacy laws. Basically claiming that JP Morgan couldn't really get the real accounts because they were protected by student privacy laws. I mean, you'd think she would have told them that little teeny tiny detail before money exchange hands. And as much as I want to see people like Charlie being brought to justice, and obviously I don't condone con artists, I can't help but think that these greedy corporate monsters who prey on society's most vulnerable, they wanted to get their hands on these students to reel them into their, credit cards and accumulate even more debt. So maybe they do need to get conned every once in a while to humble them and teach them a lesson. Don't let your greed get in the way of sound business decisions. Which leads us straight to our next case study. Much like beauty, we all know that the world revolves around wealth and status. And like beauty, you don't have to possess a drop of talent or intellect if you can trade off of these two attributes. And this is why I've chosen Meghan and Harry as an example case study, because these two are very much aware of the fact that their status as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex is their meal ticket. Or perhaps I should say was, because everything's going down the drain right now for them, including apparently their marriage. But why else would they insist on slapping on that title in every single scenario, even when accepting an award for standing up to racism within the royal family? And why else would they then slap them onto their children when they had previously asserted on multiple occasions that they wanted them to grow up as private, normal individuals away from the spotlight and the fishbowl of the royal family? Because the reality is, but for their titles, no one, least of all Spotify and Netflix, would be interested in a thing they had to say. And I don't want to sound mean, but given that I'm a nobody myself, Meghan Markle was once a nobody. So she, of all people, knows what it feels like to want to amount to something in the world, but have no one give you a chance because you're a nobody. It's kind of like a catch-22. You want to be someone important, but then you're not given a chance to be someone important because you're just not important enough. But of course, all of that changed for Meghan when she nailed Prince Harry and became a member of the British royal family, thereby attaining status. Once that was in the bag, everyone was suddenly willing to give her the time of day and, a few $100 million to boot. And the same goes for Harry, by the way. This isn't just a Meghan thing. Every opportunity afforded to him in his life, which I have learned straight from him, from his own book, from his schooling to his military career to his ridiculous appointments at Better Up and the Aspen Institute, these were all forged as a direct result of his princely title, his status. And it's this status and wealth that have both acted as money and opportunity magnets for them. These two attributes were the fire that the Netflix and Spotify and Penguin Random House moths were attracted to, only for at least one of them at this point getting quite the burn. But fear not, they will all make the same mistake again with the future Meghans and Harrys of the world, because patterns. Now, for those who may not possess the requisite attributes or qualities for this formula to work, so beauty or wealth or status, fear not. For it turns out that all of these big, scary financial entities of the world, like JP Morgan and Bank of America, are a lot easier to con than you may think. Take Anna Delvey, for instance. Now, her story is quite well known. There's even a Netflix series dedicated to it. So I'll keep it brief. She is a Russian woman who traveled to New York from Germany in 2016 when she was in her mid-20s, I believe, and conned everyone in the upper-class New York socialite scene, in addition to ultra-expensive luxury hotels like 11 Howard and the Beekman, and major banks like the Bank of America for the better part of a year. So this woman lived in luxury hotels, took private jets around the world, and dined and wined at New York's most expensive establishments, all without paying for pretty much any of it. And how did she exactly manage to pull off such a feat, you ask, when the rest of us couldn't even leave a grocery store if we were 5 cents short? Well, by abusing the predictable patterns of human behavior and creating the illusion of status and wealth. It's a classic case of elitism, really. All of these fancy hotels and eateries and banks were only too happy to allow her to utilize their services, which include getting a $22 million loan without any real due diligence, because she invented a persona of being a rich European heiress or the daughter of a Russian billionaire who is set to inherit a dynasty. That's all it took. Words. Except, you all know where this is going. The formula always ends up leading to disaster. After conning a string of hotels and luxurious eateries, Anna was eventually charged with multiple counts of grand larceny, theft of services, fraud, and other charges. And in 2019, rather than living it up in a swanky hotel room eating lobster, she instead found herself in a prison cell after she was found guilty of most of the charges against her. All of which she has denied, by the way, much like Charlie, and has gone a step further and explicitly stated that she has no regrets and would do it all again if she could.
I just don't feel guilty, and that's it. There isn't much to explain.
I hate being in jail, and it's just the worst. And I feel like I'm in jail for absolutely nothing.
Oh, and just a random tidbit, because this is so bizarre. She hired a stylist to dress her for every single day of her courtroom, and sometimes she held up the trial because she didn't like what she was wearing. Yeah, you cannot make this stuff up. But part of me admires her resourcefulness, and this is sarcasm, because she is now under house arrest. She's out of prison, awaiting a deportation order, and instead of just sitting around, biding her time, she started up a podcast. I mean, that puts Meghan and Harry to shame. Maybe Spotify should have considered signing Anna up for a deal. At least she's doing something. So there you have it. A tale of never-ending patterns and their relentless exploitation. Moral of the story, I think, don't give in to your weaknesses. Because from what I've noticed, it usually doesn't end up working in your favor. There are so many other examples that I could talk about, by the way. Many men who have orchestrated much bigger cons than these women. But I think as a young woman myself, I am more drawn to their stories. And then there's also that fascination that people have because women are usually portrayed as the gentler sex, the fairer sex, they'd never hurt a fly. When a couple of decades on this planet, or even just getting to teenagehood, is enough time to realize that that couldn't be further from the truth. We humans are so predictable in our ways, and the predators and opportunists of the world are very much aware of that. But there is a silver lining. These operators aren't really as clever as they think they are, because truly clever people would think, 10, 20, 50, 100 steps ahead and consider the consequences of their actions before actually attempting to engage in them. But unfortunately for these people, and perhaps fortunately for society, their hubris and insurmountable ego clouds their thinking. I mean, how else would you explain Meghan and Harry asking for a ride on the president's Air Force One private jet on their way home from the Queen's funeral? Did they not stop to think that this will be really humiliating if it comes out if we get rejected? No, they don't. Because as we've seen, they never stop to think. And that's why they're not as clever as they think they are. Just don't con people. Work hard. Apply yourself. The rest should come. Maybe that's naive, actually. I don't know. You tell me. I mean, so far I've seen hard work pay off for me. So, yeah. That's it. Thanks for listening. See you later.